You do not actually live in a country. That sounds like a conspiracy theory or a riddle, but from a purely biological and historical perspective, it is a cold statement of fact. If you walked outside right now and looked at the ground, you would see dirt, grass, or asphalt. You would not see a border. You would not see a line painted across the continent. You would see a physical world that does not care about passports or anthems. Yet, you almost certainly organize your entire life around the idea that you belong to a specific patch of earth defined by those invisible lines. You pay taxes to it, you obey its laws, and you might even be willing to die for it. This is a massive, global mystery that took humans nearly 300,000 years to solve. For most of our existence, the very idea of a country would have seemed like a form of insanity. So, how did a nomadic species that spent 99% of its history in small, wandering family groups suddenly decide to invent the most complex social fiction in the history of the world? We are going to treat this like a cold case. We are going to look at the clues left behind in the dirt, the grain, and the bones to find out how we trapped ourselves inside these invisible boxes. But before we find the real culprit, we have to rule out the most obvious explanation. Does a country exist because we simply outgrew our families? The first false lead in our investigation is the idea that a country is just a family that got too big. It feels natural to think that way. You have a family, they join another family to make a tribe, tribes join to make a clan, and eventually, you have a nation. But biology says that is impossible. In 1992, an evolutionary psychologist named Robin Dunbar published a groundbreaking paper in the Journal of Human Evolution. He had been studying the brain sizes of primates and noticed a very specific correlation between the size of a creature's neocortex and the size of the social group it could maintain. For humans, that number is roughly 150. This is now famously known as Dunbar's number. It represents the cognitive limit of people you can actually know as individuals. In a group of 150 or fewer, you don't need laws, police, or borders. You know who is trustworthy and who is a liar. You know who owes you a favor and who has a bad temper. You govern by gossip and reputation. But once a group hits 151 people, the system collapses. Your brain literally cannot keep track of the social math required to maintain order. Every country on Earth, even the smallest ones, has thousands or millions of people. This means a country is a structure built for a species that cannot biologically handle it. We are living in groups that our brains were never designed to navigate. If our biology limits us to 150 people, how did we ever manage to build societies of millions without killing each other immediately? The second clue in our mystery doesn't come from the human brain, but from the ground. It involves a very specific type of plant. Most people assume that humans invented farming, and then, because we had so much food, we naturally built countries. But the evidence suggests something much stranger. There is a wow fact in the history of agriculture that most textbooks skip. We settled down before we started farming. In 1928, an archaeologist named Dorothy Garrod began excavating a site called Shukba Cave in the Levant. She found evidence of a culture we now call the Natufians. Later excavations in the 1950s led by Jean Perrot at a site called Ain Malaha revealed something shocking. These people lived in permanent, circular stone houses with storage pits and cemeteries. They stayed in one place year-round. But here is the catch: they were still hunter-gatherers. They hadn't domesticated a single crop. They settled down because the wild environment was so rich that they didn't have to move. And once you settle down, your relationship with the world changes. When you are a nomad, the land is just something you walk over. When you are settled, the land becomes an investment. You bury your ancestors in it. You build walls to protect your storage pits. This is the first seed of a country. It's the moment the land stops being a place and starts being a property. But why did we transition from these small villages to massive, tax-paying states? This leads us to our next clue, which political scientist James C. Scott explored in his 2017 book, Against the Grain. Scott noticed something peculiar about every early state in history. They weren't built on just any food, they were built on grain. Specifically wheat, barley, rice, or maize. You never see an ancient state built on tubers like potatoes, yams, or cassava. But Because you can't tax a potato. A potato grows underground. It ripens at different times. You can leave it in the dirt for months and harvest it whenever you want. If a tax collector comes to your village, you can tell him the harvest was bad and he has no way of proving you're lying without digging up every square inch of your land. But grain is different. Grain grows above ground. It all ripens at exactly the same time. It is visible from a distance, and it is easy to measure, store, and transport. Scott argues that the first states were essentially grain collection machines. They didn't form because people wanted to be part of a country. They formed because an elite class figured out how to trap people in a grain cage. By forcing people to rely on a crop that was easy to count and steal, the early state could fund an army and a bureaucracy. We didn't invent countries to be free, we invented them to be taxable. But if the country was just a tax scam, why did people stay? Why didn't they just run away into the hills the moment the tax collector showed up? The investigation now moves to the geographical cage. In August of 1970, an anthropologist named Robert Carnero published a theory in the journal Science called environmental circumscription. He wanted to know why states formed in some places, like the Nile Valley, but not in others, like the Amazon basin. His conclusion was blunt. People only accept the burden of a state when they have nowhere else to go. In the Nile Valley, you have a thin strip of incredibly fertile land surrounded by a brutal, vast desert. If a local warlord tries to tax you or force you into labor, you can't just pack up and leave. If you leave the river, you die in the sand. You are trapped. Carnero pointed out that the earliest states all appeared in places where geography created a natural prison, narrow river valleys, islands, or mountain-locked plains. This is where the mystery gets dark. We find evidence of this trapping in the bones of the people who lived through it. At a site called Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, archaeologists found a cemetery from 13,000 years ago containing 59 skeletons. A 2021 study led by Isabelle Crèvecoeur proved that these people were victims of repeated, long-term violence. They were fighting over the dwindling resources of the Nile. The winners of these ancient resource wars didn't just kill the losers, they absorbed them. They created a system where you were either the ruler or the ruled, and the geography ensured you couldn't opt out. But how do you keep a population of thousands from revolting when you've trapped them? You need the third clue, the invention of the shared fiction. This is where we look at the most counterintuitive fact in our investigation. Most people think writing was invented to record great stories or religious truths. It wasn't. The first written words in human history were not, "in the beginning," or "I love you." They were accounting records. In the city-state of Uruk in Mesopotamia, around 3400 BC, we find thousands of clay tablets. Archaeologist Denise Schmant-Besserat traced these back to a system of clay tokens used to count sheep and jars of oil. Over 85% of the earliest writing found at Uruk is purely administrative. It's lists of rations, taxes, and inventories. The country was built on paperwork before it was built on anything else. To manage thousands of strangers, you needed a way to turn them into numbers. This required a massive mental shift. You had to stop seeing your neighbor as the guy with the broken leg and start seeing him as citizen number 402 who owes 3 bushels of barley. And to make this work, the state began to mass-produce identity. At Uruk, archaeologists found hundreds of thousands of beveled rim bowls. These were crude, standardized clay bowls used to distribute grain rations to workers. Everyone got the same bowl. Everyone got the same amount. The state was training people to be interchangeable. It was the first time in history that humans were expected to act like parts of a machine rather than members of a family. But even with paperwork and bowls, you still needed something to make the people believe they were one unit. What was the secret ingredient that turned a tax district into a homeland? The breakthrough in our case comes from a concept called imagined communities, a term coined by Benedict Anderson in 1983. Anderson wanted to know why people who will never meet each other feel a deep, emotional connection to their fellow citizens. Why do you feel a surge of pride when someone from your country wins an Olympic medal, even though you had nothing to do with it? Anderson's clue was the printing press. Before the 1500s, most people in Europe didn't think of themselves as French or German. They thought of themselves as members of a village or followers of a specific lord. But when the printing press started churning out books and newspapers in local languages, rather than just Latin, millions of people began reading the same stories and news at the same time. This created a simultaneous experience. Even if you were in a village 300 miles away, you were reading the same headlines as a person in the capital. You began to imagine that you were part of a giant, invisible we. The country moved from being a tax list on a clay tablet to a feeling in the chest. This was solidified by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. After decades of brutal religious wars, European leaders agreed to a new set of rules. They decided that every state had sovereignty over its territory. They drew firm lines on maps and agreed that whatever happened inside those lines was nobody else's business. This is the moment the modern country was officially born. It was a legal agreement between kings that eventually became an emotional reality for the people. But is this imagined reality actually stable? To answer that, we have to look at the maintenance clue. How do you keep the fiction alive? The answer is collective forgetting. The French philosopher Ernest Renan gave a famous lecture in 1882 where he argued that a nation is not just about what people remember together, but what they agree to forget. To make a country work, you have to forget that your borders were probably drawn by a conqueror who killed your ancestors. You have to forget that your language was likely forced on your grandparents by a state education system. When Italy unified in 1861, only about 2.5% of the population spoke what we now call Standard Italian. The rest spoke regional dialects that were often mutually unintelligible. One of the architects of unification, Massimo d'Azeglio, famously said, "We have made Italy. Now we must make Italians." The country came first. The people who felt like countrymen had to be manufactured later through schools, flags, and national myths. This brings us to the verdict of our investigation. The country is not a natural development of human evolution. It is a series of technological workarounds, grain, writing, geography, and print, designed to force a species built for groups of 150 into groups of 150 million. It is a highly successful, incredibly powerful, and utterly fragile hallucination that we all agree to have at the same time. But what happens if we stop believing the story? The investigation into the origin of countries reveals a truth that is both impressive and deeply unsettling. We didn't invent countries because we were searching for a better way to love each other or a more efficient way to build a civilization. We invented them because we got caught in a series of traps. We got trapped by the richness of certain environments like the Nile Valley, which forced us to settle down. We got trapped by the biological reality of our own brains, which couldn't handle the social complexity of growing populations. We got trapped by the specific chemistry of grain, which made our labor visible and stealable for the first time. The borders you see on a map today are the scars of these ancient traps. They are the leftovers of tax districts, the results of geographic cages, and the remnants of 17th-century legal treaties. When you look at your passport, you aren't looking at a biological reality. You are looking at a piece of the machine that manages the 150-person animal in a 1.4 billion-person world. It is the only thing that keeps us from collapsing back into the tribal chaos of the Pleistocene. But that raises a final, quiet question that we rarely dare to ask. If the country is just a story we told ourselves to survive the invention of the city, what happens when the story no longer fits the world we've built? Think about the scale of what we have achieved through this fiction. We have used the idea of the country to build hospitals that serve millions, to create massive infrastructure that spans continents, and to organize the labor of an entire species. But we have also used it to justify the slaughter of millions in the name of lines that don't exist. The imagined community is the most powerful tool ever created, but it is a tool that requires constant maintenance. Every time a child stands for an anthem, every time a soldier guards a fence, and every time you fill out a tax form, you are casting a vote to keep the fiction alive. You are participating in what Renan called the daily plebiscite. We choose to live in countries every single morning. We wake up and decide that the invisible line is more real than the dirt beneath our feet. We decide that a stranger 3,000 miles away is our brother, while a person 10 miles away across a border is a foreigner. This is the ultimate victory of the country. It has replaced our biological senses with a legal imagination. We no longer see the world as it is. We see it as we have been told it was partitioned 400 years ago. And that brings us to the end of our investigation, where the clues all lead to a single, undeniable conclusion. The invention of the country was an act of desperation. It was the only way to prevent the total collapse of order once we settled into permanent homes and our populations exploded. We traded the freedom of the nomad for the security of the citizen. We traded the intimate world of the family for the grand world of the nation. It was a bargain made in the shadow of grain silos and city walls. And it is a bargain that you are still honoring today. You might feel like a free individual with a unique identity, but in the eyes of the system you live in, you are a data point in an administrative record that began in Uruk 6,000 years ago. You are a taxpayer in a system designed to harvest your labor. You are a member of an imagined community that exists only as long as you and your neighbors agree to ignore the fact that the borders are a myth. The country is not a place you live. It is a contract you signed without realizing it. And that leads us to the most uncomfortable realization of all, one that changes how you look at every map you will ever see for the rest of your life. Every country on this planet is a temporary agreement. They feel permanent, they feel ancient, and they feel like the natural order of things, but they are just a blink in the timeline of our species. We spent 290,000 years without them, and we have spent only a few thousand with them. They are a fragile experiment in human cooperation. The borders of the past have already dissolved, and the borders of the present are shifting even as you read this. We are a species of 150-person primates trying to run a planetary civilization through a series of local myths. It is an impossible task that we somehow manage to perform every single day. But never forget that the lines are not in the earth, they are in your head. You are living inside a collective dream that has been running for 6 millennia, a dream of walls, grain, and paperwork. And the only thing keeping that dream from turning back into the dust of the desert is your willingness to keep believing in it when you wake up tomorrow. The mystery of how we invented countries is not about the past. It is about the present. It is about the fact that you are currently inhabiting a ghost story. For 300,000 years, the earth was a vast, open space where no one was a stranger because everyone belonged to a small, intimate circle. Then, in the last few seconds of our history, we divided that space into nearly 200 boxes and told ourselves that the boxes are what define us. You are a biological entity that evolved to live in a forest with your cousins, but you have been convinced to live in a legal fiction with 100 million strangers. Every comfort you have, every law that protects you, and every war that threatens you exists because you have accepted a story that has no physical basis in reality. You are trapped in a cage made of words and maps, and the most terrifying part of the mystery is that you are the one holding the key. You have been told that your country is your home, but the truth is much colder. Your country is a managed enclosure designed for a species that grew too large for its own brain. You are not a citizen of a land, you are a resident of a bureaucracy that hasn't changed its basic logic since the first grain was harvested in Mesopotamia. The walls are still there, the taxes are still being counted, and the story is still being told. And the moment you stop believing in it, the invisible lines will vanish, leaving you alone on a planet that does not know your name. Do you think you would actually be free if the lines disappeared, or would you just be lost? This was a journey through the mechanics of our own capture. We looked at the social limits of the brain, the taxation of grain, the geography of the Nile, and the power of the printing press to show how the world was partitioned. But even as the mystery is solved, the reality remains. You will wake up tomorrow in a country. You will use its currency, you will speak its language, and you will obey its borders. The fiction is too powerful to break, and the alternatives are too chaotic to imagine. We are the architects of our own boundaries, the prisoners of our own success. And as you go about your day, moving through the invisible partitions of the world, remember this one cold, undeniable fact that makes all your national pride and political debates feel small. The earth has no borders, but the human mind can no longer survive without them. You are an animal that has forgotten how to be wild, living in a world that has been turned into a ledger. You are exactly where the grain kings of Uruk wanted you to be, organized, counted, and contained. Your identity is a filing system. Your home is a map. And your reality is a story that only works if you never stop to look at the ground and realize there is nothing there.